There's a skeleton sitting in a museum in Nairobi that tells one of the most humbling stories in all of human history. It's not impressive at first glance. The bones are brown, fragile, incomplete. But this skeleton, known as Turkana Boy, represents something that should make every person alive today stop and think. Because the species this boy belonged to, Homo erectus, survived on Earth for nearly 2 million years. Not 2,000. Not 200,000. 2 million. And we, modern humans, have only been around for about 300,000 years at most. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. If Homo erectus were a person who lived for 80 years, our entire history as Homo sapiens would be the last 12 years of their life. Everything we've accomplished, every civilization, every empire, every technological breakthrough from the invention of writing to landing on the moon, all of it fits into what would be their teenage years. We are newcomers. And the species that came before us, the one we rarely think about, the one that doesn't get the glamorous museum exhibits or the popular documentaries, they were the real survivors. The story begins in 1891 on the Indonesian island of Java. A Dutch surgeon named Eugène Dubois, driven by an obsession to find the missing link between apes and humans, was digging along the Solo River when his workers uncovered something extraordinary. Thick, heavy, with prominent brow ridges that jutted out like a shelf above where the eyes would have been. Then a thigh bone, remarkably modern in appearance, built for walking upright. Dubois knew immediately he had found something significant, something that would rewrite human history. He called it Pithecanthropus erectus, erect ape man. The name didn't stick. Scientists eventually renamed it Homo erectus, upright human. But Dubois was right about one thing. This was a turning point in the human story. To have body proportions that would blend in from a distance if you dressed them in modern clothes and put them on a street corner. But here's what Dubois didn't know. Couldn't have known. This species, this Homo erectus, had been walking the earth for over 1 million years when the individual he found died. And it would continue walking the earth for hundreds of thousands of years after. The fossils Dubois discovered were roughly 1 million years old. But the species itself, it first appeared in Africa nearly 2 million years ago. And the very last of them, clinging to existence on the island of Java, didn't disappear until sometime between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. Do the math. That's 1,900,000 years of continuous existence. 1.9 million years during which Homo erectus was born, lived, died, had children, faced challenges, adapted, survived. For context, the oldest confirmed fossils of our species, Homo sapiens, are about 300,000 years old. Some researchers argue we might go back as far as 500,000 years if you count very early transitional forms. Even if you're generous and give us 500,000 years, Homo erectus still lived nearly 4 times longer than we have. And it's not just the duration that's remarkable, it's the scale. Homo erectus was the first human species to leave Africa, the first to spread across multiple continents, the first to face the challenge of surviving not just in the warm savannas where our lineage evolved, but in the cold grasslands of northern China, the tropical islands of Indonesia, the temperate forests of Europe. Possibly, the evidence is still debated. They were everywhere, or at least everywhere that Stone Age humans with limited technology could possibly reach. From Africa, they walked to Georgia, the country nestled between the Black and Caspian Seas. Fossils from Dmanisi, dated to 1.85 million years ago, show Homo erectus was already living outside Africa within a couple 100,000 years of first appearing in the fossil record. Think about how fast that is in evolutionary terms. A species evolves in Africa, and almost immediately, geologically speaking, they're on another continent. What made them leave when their ancestors had been content to stay in Africa for millions of years? Then they kept going, east into Asia. Fossils from China, the famous Peking man discoveries from the 1920s, show Homo erectus thriving in environments nothing like the African homeland, south and east to the islands of Indonesia. The islands of the Mediterranean, where some researchers believe they also arrived, though this remains controversial. Everywhere they went, they adapted. Everywhere they settled, they stayed. For hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes over 1 million years in the same region, Homo erectus populations persisted while the world changed around them. Ice ages came and went, climates shifted, sea levels rose and fell, volcanic eruptions reshaped landscapes, and through it all, Homo erectus survived. Now, here's where the story gets frustrating for scientists, because despite being one of the most successful species in human history, despite leaving fossils across 3 continents, despite having a nearly 2 million year track record, we still don't fully understand how they did it. We don't know why they were so successful. We can't explain what gave them the resilience to outlast every other human species that came before them, and most that came after. The fossil record gives us snapshots. A skull here, a femur there, occasionally a nearly complete skeleton like Turkana Boy. Hundreds of thousands of years, where we have almost nothing. Entire populations that must have existed, must have lived and died and passed on their genes, but left no trace we've found. The story of Homo erectus is written in fragments, and the fragments raise more questions than they answer. Their brains were bigger than their predecessors, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, but smaller than ours. Homo erectus brains ranged from about 600 cubic centimeters in the earliest individuals to over 1,200 in some later populations. That's a huge range, and it raises an obvious question. If brain size matters, if it's the key to survival, why did Homo erectus with their smaller brains outlive every other human species? Why are they the success story while species with larger brains came and went? The tools they made were sophisticated for their time but limited. The Acheulean hand axe, a teardrop-shaped stone tool flaked on both sides, shows up in the archaeological record about 1.76 million years ago. And then, remarkably, it barely changes for over 1 million years. The same basic design, the same manufacturing technique, passed down through countless generations across vast geographic distances. Some archaeologists see this as evidence of remarkable cultural stability. Others see it as evidence of cognitive limitations, an inability to innovate beyond a certain point. But here's the thing, whatever limitations they might have had didn't stop them from surviving for 2 million years. Didn't stop them from adapting to environments that should have killed them. Scientists have proposed dozens of theories to explain Homo erectus' success. Better body proportions for long-distance walking and running. Larger brains that allowed for better planning and tool use. Control of fire for cooking food, warmth, and protection from predators. Though the evidence for when this actually started is hotly debated. More efficient hunting strategies. Stronger social bonds. Greater dietary flexibility. Each of these probably played a role, but none of them alone explains the full story. None of them explains why this particular species, with these particular traits, managed to persist through climate catastrophes that would have wiped out populations with larger brains and supposedly superior technology. And then there's the extinction. After surviving for 1.9 million years, after weathering countless environmental challenges, Homo erectus disappeared. The last populations in Java went extinct sometime between 117 and 108,000 years ago, just as modern humans were beginning to spread out of Africa, just as Neanderthals were thriving in Europe, just as Denisovans were living in Asia. The world was full of humans again, multiple species coexisting, competing, possibly interbreeding, and Homo erectus, the old survivor, the species that had seen it all, finally couldn't keep up. Why? What changed? Some researchers point to climate. The open woodlands where Java's Homo erectus had lived for over 1 million years were being replaced by dense rainforest, a habitat shift that would have required new tools, new strategies, new adaptations. Maybe after 2 million years of success, they had become too specialized in their own way, too adapted to the environments they knew. Others point to competition. Modern humans were smarter, more innovative, more flexible. When we arrived, whenever we encountered Homo erectus, we may have simply outcompeted them, taken their resources, hunted the same game more efficiently. We don't know if modern humans and Homo erectus ever met face to face. The dates are frustratingly close. The last Homo erectus in Java died out around 110,000 years ago. Modern humans reached Java around 73,000 years ago. That's a gap of 37,000 years. Close enough to make you wonder. Far enough that we can't be certain. What we do know is this. Homo erectus represents something profound about human evolution that we're only beginning to appreciate. For most of the time our genus has existed, we weren't the dominant species. We weren't even close. Homo erectus held that title. They were the successful ones, the survivors, the species that figured out how to make it work in a changing world. And maybe that's what makes their story so important right now, because we're facing our own period of rapid environmental change, our own climate crisis, our own test of whether we can adapt fast enough to survive what's coming. Homo erectus had 2 million years to prove they could handle change. We've had 300,000, and the jury is still out on whether we'll make it another 300,000, whether we'll even make it another few hundred years at the rate we're going. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. Maybe subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are right now. Tokyo at midnight? New York at 2 in the morning? Sydney at dawn? It's strange and wonderful how we're all here, scattered across this planet that Homo erectus once called home, thinking about the species that came before us, the ones who survived longer than we have, the ones who might have something to teach us about what it really takes to make it in this world. Picture this. You're looking at a skeleton from 3.4 million years ago. Lucy, the famous Australopithecus afarensis. Her arms are long relative to her body, built for climbing trees. Her legs are short, her hips are wide. She's bipedal. Yes, she walks upright, but she's clearly transitional. Part ape, part human. A compromise between life in the trees and life on the ground. Now, jump forward to 1.6 million years ago. Less than 2 million years later, which in evolutionary terms is actually pretty quick. You're looking at Turkana Boy, that skeleton I mentioned at the start. And everything has changed. He's 5'3" at the time of death, and he was only about 8 or 9 years old. Estimates suggest he would have reached over 6 feet if he'd lived to adulthood. His arms are shorter in proportion to his body. His legs are long, built for walking and running. His hips are narrow. His body proportions are modern. If you dressed him in contemporary clothing and put a hat on his head to hide the shape of his skull, he'd look like a teenage human walking down the street. This is the Homo erectus body plan. And it appears in the fossil record shockingly complete. Not as a gradual transition, not as a series of incremental changes spread across millions of years. It just shows up, fully formed. Modern in almost every way that matters for locomotion. Scientists call this morphological transformation sudden, which in geology speak means it happened relatively fast. But fast is still hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a few 100,000 at most. The earliest Homo erectus fossils from around 2 million years ago already show these proportions. The latest Australopithecus fossils from around 2.5 million years ago still show the old pattern. Somewhere in that 500,000-year gap, something dramatic happened. But here's the mystery. The fossil record from that crucial period is terrible. We have a handful of fragments, bits of skull, pieces of jawbone, not enough to track the transition step by step. Not enough to see how a species with Lucy's proportions became a species with Turkana Boy's proportions. The before and after are clear, the process is invisible. And this bothers anthropologists. A lot. Because such dramatic changes should leave traces. There should be intermediate forms. Skeletons that show elongating legs and shortening arms. Hips that are transitioning from wide to narrow. Bodies that are clearly neither one thing nor the other. But we don't have them. Not in sufficient numbers to reconstruct the pathway. We have the endpoints, and we're left to speculate about what happened in between. The leg lengthening is particularly interesting because it's not just about height, it's about efficiency. Long legs relative to body size make you a better long-distance walker, a better runner. You cover more ground with each stride. You use less energy per kilometre travelled. For a species expanding its range, for populations that needed to walk further to find food, to follow migrating herds, to explore new territories, longer legs would be an enormous advantage. But longer legs also create problems. They raise your centre of gravity. They make you less stable when climbing. They're a commitment to life on the ground. Australopithecus could still scramble up trees relatively easily. They could escape predators by going vertical. Homo erectus gave that up. Their body plan says, we're staying on the ground, we're walking, we're running, and we're not going back to the trees. That's a risky bet in an African landscape full of large predators. Lions, leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats. All of them would love to eat a human-sized primate that can't escape into the trees. So why make that trade? What advantage was worth giving up the safety of climbing? The answer, most researchers think, is meat. More specifically, access to meat from large animals. Carcasses too big to drag into trees. Kills that had to be processed on the ground. Homo erectus was transitioning from occasional scavenger to more regular meat eater. Maybe even active hunter. Though the evidence for hunting this early is limited. And to do that successfully, they needed to cover distance, to follow herds, to compete with other scavengers for fresh kills. Long legs made that possible. But then there's the skull. The Homo erectus skull is weird in ways that scientists still can't fully explain. The skull bones in some Homo erectus individuals are among the thickest in the entire human fossil record. Twice as thick as modern human skulls in some places. And nobody knows why. Some researchers think it's related to diet. Thick skulls could anchor powerful chewing muscles, suggesting they were eating tough, hard-to-process foods. But the teeth don't really support this. Homo erectus teeth are actually smaller than earlier hominins. The molars are reduced, the jaw is weaker. All signs of a diet that was softer, easier to chew. Maybe because they were using tools to process food. Maybe because they were cooking. Others suggest it's mechanical. Protection from impacts. Maybe Homo erectus lifestyles were violent. Maybe they were hitting each other in the head a lot, fighting over resources, mates, territory. Thick skulls would be advantageous if cranial trauma was common. But there's limited evidence for violence in the fossil record. No more than you'd expect from any primate population. The thick skull theory based on violence doesn't hold up well. A third idea is that it's thermal. Thick bones provide insulation. Maybe in the hot environments where Homo erectus evolved and lived, thick skull bones helped regulate brain temperature, kept the brain from overheating during long days of walking and hunting in the African sun. This is plausible, but hard to test. We can't exactly measure the cranial temperature of extinct species. The truth is, scientists don't have a satisfying answer. The thick Homo erectus skull is one of those features that clearly served some function. Natural selection doesn't preserve traits that don't matter, but we can't figure out what that function was. It's an evolutionary puzzle that's been sitting in plain sight for over a century. Then there's the variation. Because Homo erectus wasn't just one thing, it was a species, or maybe multiple species depending on which researcher you ask, spread across 3 continents and nearly 2 million years, and the variation between populations is substantial. Early African Homo erectus, sometimes called Homo ergaster, by researchers who think they deserve separate species status, had slightly smaller brains, around 600 to 800 cubic centimeters. Asian Homo erectus from later periods had larger brains, averaging around 1,000 cubic centimeters. Some Indonesian specimens reached 1,200 cubic centimeters, overlapping with the lower end of modern human range. This is weird because usually in evolution, you see progressive trends, traits that consistently change in one direction across time. But Homo erectus brain size is all over the place. Early populations small, some later populations large. Some late surviving populations, like the ones in Java that lasted until 100,000 years ago, still had relatively small brains. There's no clear directional trend, no obvious progression toward larger and larger brains. The same goes for body size. Turkana boy would have been tall for a Homo erectus, probably over 6 feet. But fossils from Dmanisi in Georgia, dated to 1.8 million years ago, show individuals who are much smaller, 5 feet tall or less, more lightly built, almost gracile in appearance. Were these different subspecies? Different regional populations? Evidence of sexual dimorphism? Males much larger than females? We can't tell because we don't have enough skeletons from any single location and time period to compare. What we do know is that this variation didn't seem to hurt them. Small-brained or large-brained, tall or short, heavily built or gracile, Homo erectus survived, thrived even. Spread across the world, the specific details of their anatomy mattered less than whatever behavioral and cognitive toolkit they possessed. And that toolkit, whatever it was, worked. The face of Homo erectus is another distinctive feature. It's long and relatively flat compared to earlier hominins. The nose projects forward, creating a bridge. Modern humans have this too. Most apes don't. Their nostrils are flush with their face. In hot, arid environments, you lose moisture every time you exhale. A projecting nose with longer nasal passages allows air to cool and humidify before it reaches your lungs on the way in, and allows moisture to be recaptured before you exhale. It's a desert adaptation, evidence that at least some Homo erectus populations were living in drier environments than their ancestors. And this brings us to a fascinating recent discovery. In 2025, just this year, researchers published a study showing that Homo erectus was living in desert-like conditions in East Africa 1 million years ago. Not just surviving, thriving. The fossil site at Oldupai Gorge in Tanzania shows evidence of Homo erectus populations repeatedly returning to specific locations near rivers and water sources during periods of extreme drought. Times when the landscape was essentially a desert. Less than 10 inches of rain per year. For decades, anthropologists assumed only modern humans had the cognitive flexibility to survive in extreme environments like true deserts or dense rainforests. The conventional wisdom was that earlier hominins were restricted to more moderate habitats. Savanna woodlands, mixed environments with both open and closed canopy areas, but the new evidence demolishes that assumption. And they were doing it 1 million years ago. How? The research team found evidence that these populations were incredibly strategic about resource use. They set up camp at river confluences, places where 2 watercourses met. This would give them reliable access to water even during droughts. They were making advanced stone tools, Acheulean hand axes with carefully prepared cores. They knew their landscape intimately, knew where to find food, where to find water, when to move and when to stay. This isn't the behavior of a primitive, barely capable hominin. This is sophisticated ecological knowledge. This is planning. This is a species that understood their environment deeply enough to survive in conditions that should have been impossible for them. And it wasn't just deserts. Other recent discoveries show Homo erectus living at high altitudes 2 million years ago in the Ethiopian highlands. The air is thinner up there. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night. The climate is harsh. And yet, there they were, making tools, processing food, raising children, living. The Homo erectus body plan, it turns out, wasn't just modern-looking. It was genuinely capable, built for endurance, built for adaptability, built to survive in environments that would push the limits of what we thought possible for a hominin with their level of technology and brain size. But here's what keeps anthropologists awake at night. All these capabilities, all these adaptations, they appeared relatively suddenly in evolutionary terms. The jump from Australopithecus to Homo erectus is one of the biggest morphological leaps in human evolution. Can't say with certainty what selection pressures drove it. Can't reconstruct the intermediate steps. We have the result, a species with a body plan that worked so well it barely changed for 2 million years. A species that could walk further, run longer, and survive in more diverse environments than anything that came before. But the process, the actual evolutionary pathway, that's still largely mysterious. Maybe the fossils are out there waiting to be found, buried in sediments that haven't been explored, eroding out of cliff faces in regions where paleontologists haven't looked yet. Maybe someday we'll find the transitional forms that show exactly how Homo erectus evolved their remarkable body. Or maybe we won't. Maybe those fossils are gone, destroyed by time and geology and the relentless processes that erase most traces of the past. Maybe we'll have to be content with the snapshots we have, the before and after. But even incomplete, the story of the Homo erectus body tells us something profound. Evolution doesn't always work in slow, gradual increments. Sometimes there are leaps. Sometimes dramatic changes happen relatively fast. And sometimes those changes work so well that they barely need to change again for millions of years. The Homo erectus body plan was one of evolution's success stories, a design that worked, that endured. And we're still trying to figure out how it all came together. There's a question that has haunted anthropology for decades, a puzzle so frustrating that researchers have built entire careers trying to solve it. How did Homo erectus double their brain size without cooking their food? Let me explain why this matters. Your brain, right now, is consuming about 20% of all the calories you eat. 20%. Despite being only about 2% of your body weight. It's the most metabolically expensive organ you have. Every thought, every memory, every sensation requires energy. Lots of it. And that energy has to come from somewhere. For a species to evolve a larger brain, they need to be able to fuel it. They need access to enough high-quality calories that they can afford the metabolic cost. This is why gorillas, who eat mostly plants, have relatively small brains despite having massive bodies. Their diet is so low in calories per unit that they'd need to eat constantly to support a larger brain. They already spend up to 8 hours a day just chewing. Adding brain tissue would require even more feeding time. There aren't enough hours in the day, but Homo erectus didn't have this problem. Their brains, which started around 600 cubic centimeters in the earliest fossils, expanded to over 1,000 cubic centimeters in many later populations. Some individuals reached 1,200 cubic centimeters. That's a doubling, maybe more. A massive increase in metabolic demand that somehow they managed to meet. The leading theory, championed by primatologist Richard Wrangham and others, is cooking. The idea is elegant. Cooking pre-digests food. It breaks down tough plant fibers. It denatures proteins, making them easier to absorb. It kills pathogens. A cooked meal delivers far more usable calories than the same meal eaten raw. Studies with pythons, which have highly measurable digestive responses, show they expend significantly less energy, breaking down cooked meat versus raw meat. The same principle should apply to primates. Wrangham argues that cooking was the key innovation that allowed Homo erectus to support their larger brains. That's somewhere around 2 million years ago, when Homo erectus first appears in the fossil record with their expanded cranial capacity. They must have gained control of fire and begun systematically cooking their food. This freed up calories, reduced time spent chewing, allowed the gut to shrink, which is exactly what we see in Homo erectus compared to earlier hominins. It's a beautiful theory, neat, testable, except for one massive problem. There's almost no archaeological evidence for controlled fire at 2 million years ago, or 1.9 million, or 1.8 million. The evidence for systematic fire use doesn't really become solid until much, much later. The earliest claimed evidence of fire use by hominins is controversial. Sites in Kenya from around 1.5 million years ago show sediments that may have been heated, reddened earth that could indicate campfires. But it could also indicate natural brush fires, volcanic activity, lightning strikes. The evidence is ambiguous. In China, at Zhou Cave where Peking Man was found, there's ash and burned bone from around 500,000 years ago. That's pretty solid evidence. But it's also more than 1 million years after Homo erectus first appeared with their larger brains. In South Africa, at Swartkrans Cave, there are burned bones with cut marks from around 1 million years ago. Again, interesting, but late. The most convincing evidence for habitual fire use comes from sites around 400,000 years ago. Qesem Cave in Israel, Beecher's Pit in England, multiple European sites. By this time, Homo erectus had already been around for over 1 million years with their big brains. The timeline doesn't match. Wrangham and his supporters argue that fire evidence degrades quickly. That absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That early hominins might have been using fire in ways that didn't leave clear archaeological traces. Maybe they used fire opportunistically, gathering embers from natural wildfires and maintaining them rather than creating fire from scratch. Maybe they used it outdoors where the evidence would be destroyed by weathering rather than in caves where it would be protected. All of this is possible. But it's also speculation. The hard evidence, the kind of evidence that convinces skeptical scientists, simply isn't there for fire use at 2 million years ago, which creates a paradox. If Homo erectus didn't have cooking, how did they fuel their expanding brains? The alternative explanation is diet shift. The idea that Homo erectus incorporated more high-quality foods into their diet, even without cooking. Specifically, meat. Animal tissue is calorie-dense. Fat, even more so. A pound of meat contains far more usable energy than a pound of plant material. And crucially, it requires less time to chew and digest. Evidence for meat eating goes back further than evidence for fire. Cut marks on animal bones, made by stone tools, appear in the archaeological record over 2 million years ago. These marks show that hominins were butchering animals, removing meat from carcasses. Whether they were hunting or scavenging is debated, but either way, they were eating meat regularly enough to leave traces. Some researchers argue that increased meat consumption alone could explain the brain expansion. That Homo erectus didn't need cooking. They just needed to eat more animal products and fewer plants. This reduced the time spent feeding, shrank the gut, freed up metabolic resources for the brain. Problem solved. Except, other researchers point out that raw meat is actually pretty hard to digest. Try it sometime. Not recommended, by the way. Raw meat is tough, chewy, and your stomach has to work hard to break it down. Studies with modern humans eating raw meat diets show they struggle to maintain weight. They get thinner. They have digestive problems. It's not the magical solution it might seem, but here's where it gets interesting. Stone tools might have acted as external digestive systems. Homo erectus had sharp flakes. They had hand axes. They could cut meat into small pieces, pound tough plant material to break down fibers, pre-process their food mechanically, even if they weren't cooking it. Research shows that simply slicing meat and pounding tubers can reduce chewing time by up to 50%. That's huge. That's comparable to some of the benefits you get from cooking. So maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. Maybe Homo erectus was eating more meat, using tools to process both meat and plants more thoroughly, and occasionally using fire when they could get it. From natural sources to soften especially tough foods. No single innovation, just a package of dietary and technological changes that together provided enough extra calories to fuel bigger brains. This is frustrating for researchers who like clean answers, who want to point to a specific innovation and say this is what made us human. But evolution rarely works that way. Usually, it's multiple factors interacting, multiple selection pressures pushing in the same direction, multiple advantages that combine to create something new. The brain size variation within Homo erectus makes this even more complicated. Because brain size wasn't constant across populations, early African Homo erectus had brains around 700 to 800 cubic centimeters. Asian Homo erectus, from later periods, averaged 1,000 cubic centimeters. Some late Indonesian specimens reached 1,200 cubic centimeters. If cooking was the key, you'd expect brain size to increase suddenly when fire control appeared, then stay at that new level. But that's not what we see. Brain size varies. It goes up in some populations, stays lower in others. There's no clear correlation with fire evidence. Populations living at times when we have good evidence for fire don't necessarily have bigger brains than populations from periods when fire evidence is absent. This suggests that brain size in Homo erectus was responding to multiple factors: local environmental pressures, dietary opportunities specific to different regions, social complexity, tool use, sophistication. No single variable was determining outcome. It works with whatever variation is available in a population, selecting for traits that improve survival and reproduction in that specific time and place. But let's talk about fire specifically for a moment. Because even though we don't have solid evidence for its controlled use at 2 million years ago, we do have increasingly early hints, and the hints are fascinating. In 2023, researchers used new techniques involving artificial intelligence and spectroscopy to analyze sediments from sites in East Africa. They found microscopic traces of wood ash in deposits dating to around 1 million years ago. not charcoal from a wildfire. Wood ash, which has a different chemical signature. Wood ash that suggests someone was burning wood in a controlled way. For warmth maybe, for light. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, there's evidence of controlled fire from around 1 million years ago as well. Ash layers, burned bones, heated sediments in patterns suggesting hearths. Someone was maintaining fires inside this cave 1 million years ago. Not occasionally, regularly, for long periods. By 800,000 years ago, the evidence becomes more widespread. Sites in Israel, Spain, multiple locations in Africa. Fire is showing up in the archaeological record with increasing frequency. And by 400,000 years ago, it's ubiquitous. Every major archaeological site from this period onward has evidence of fire use. It had become a standard part of the hominin toolkit. What fire did for Homo erectus, beyond potentially enabling cooking, was dramatic. It extended the day. Before fire, hominins were like other primates, active during daylight, resting at night in trees or protected locations. Fire changed that. You could stay up after dark. You could see. You could work on tools. You could socialize. The evidence suggests that controlled fire led to new social behaviors, gathering around the flames, storytelling possibly, sharing food cooked or warmed by the fire. These activities would have strengthened social bonds, increased cooperation, helped transmit knowledge between generations. Fire also expanded their range. With fire, Homo erectus could survive in colder climates. They could live in temperate zones where winters would otherwise be deadly. They could occupy caves that would be too cold without warmth. This may explain how they spread so far north into Asia and Europe. How populations survived through climate fluctuations. Fire was insurance against the cold, and fire kept predators away. Large cats, hyenas, other dangerous animals, they're afraid of flames. A fire at the cave entrance or camp perimeter would provide protection at night, would allow Homo erectus to sleep on the ground safely, to stay in one place longer, to accumulate possessions and tools rather than constantly moving to evade threats. But here's the paradox that brings us back to where we started. All these benefits of fire, all these ways it would have helped Homo erectus survive and thrive. And yet, the evidence suggests they managed without it, or with only occasional access to it, for potentially hundreds of thousands of years. The earliest Homo erectus populations, the ones from 2 million years ago, with brains already significantly larger than their predecessors, they probably didn't have reliable fire. And they survived anyway. This tells us something important about Homo erectus. They were adaptable. They could make do with what was available. If they had fire, great, they'd use it. If they didn't, they'd find other solutions. Better tools for processing food, better hunting or scavenging strategies to get more meat, better social cooperation to defend against predators, better site selection to find naturally protected locations. The cooking hypothesis might be wrong about the timing. It might be wrong about cooking being necessary for brain expansion, but it's probably right about one thing. Once Homo erectus did gain reliable control of fire, whenever that was, it would have been transformative. It would have made everything easier, provided more calories with less effort, extended their activity period, expanded their range, strengthened their social bonds. And this is why the debate continues. Why researchers keep arguing about when fire control began and what role it played. Because fire is so fundamental to the human experience that it's hard to imagine our evolution without it. Yet the evidence, stubborn and fragmentary as it is, suggests they did. Used tools, ate meat, processed foods mechanically, adapted their behavior and technology to extract maximum nutrition from available resources. Only later, perhaps 1 million years into their existence, did fire become reliable. Did it shift from opportunistic use of natural fires to deliberate creation and maintenance of flames? And once that happened, once they had that technology fully integrated into their way of life, they became even more successful. The brain expansion of Homo erectus remains one of the great puzzles of human evolution. We know it happened. We can measure it in the skulls. We know it was metabolically expensive. We know it required dietary changes to fuel. But the exact package of innovations that made it possible, the precise timeline of when different technologies appeared, the relative importance of cooking versus tool use versus meat eating, all of that is still being worked out. And maybe we'll never have perfect answers. Maybe the evidence is too fragmentary, the timescales too vast, the behavior too complex to reduce to simple explanations. But that's okay, because what we do know is remarkable enough. Homo erectus doubled their brain size, survived for 2 million years, spread across the world, with or without cooking, with or without reliable fire. They figured out how to fuel those big brains and make them work. And that, ultimately, is what matters. For decades, anthropologists operated under a comfortable assumption. Early hominins, they believed, were ecological specialists. They needed specific environments to survive. Savanna woodlands with the right mix of trees and grassland. Access to water, moderate temperatures, not too hot, not too cold, not too dry, certainly not desert conditions, certainly not high mountain environments. These early humans, with their limited technology and smaller brains, simply couldn't handle extremes. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, we're the generalists. We're the ones who can live anywhere. From the Arctic tundra to the Sahara Desert, from coastal jungles to high mountain plateaus. This adaptability, conventional wisdom held, was what made us special. What separated us from our more primitive ancestors. Then, in January 2025, a research team published a study that shattered this assumption completely, and the implications are still rippling through the field of paleoanthropology. The team was working at Oldupai Gorge in Tanzania. Not Olduvai, the more familiar spelling. The site's traditional name, the one local communities have used for generations, is Oldupai. It's one of the most important paleoanthropological sites in the world, a place where the earth has opened up to reveal millions of years of human prehistory, where you can literally walk among stone tools made by hands that have been dust for over 1 million years. The researchers were examining a specific layer of sediment dated to around 1 million years ago. They used multiple techniques, analyzed pollen grains preserved in the soil to reconstruct what plants were growing, studied the chemistry of the sediment to understand rainfall and temperature, ran climate models to simulate what conditions would have been like, and what they found shocked them. 1 million years ago, this region of Tanzania was a desert, not a semi-arid savanna, not a seasonal dry woodland, a genuine, harsh, brutal desert. Annual rainfall under 10 inches. Temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. A landscape of scattered shrubs and drought-resistant plants. The kind of environment that kills unprepared humans in days. And Homo erectus was living there, not just passing through, not just surviving at the margins, thriving. The archaeological evidence shows they returned to this location repeatedly over thousands of years. They set up camps near river confluences where 2 waterways met. They made sophisticated stone tools. They processed food. They raised children, in conditions that scientists had insisted were impossible for early hominins to tolerate. This wasn't an isolated discovery. The same study found similar evidence from multiple time periods at Oldupai. Homo erectus populations living in desert conditions repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years. Every time the climate dried out, every time the woodlands gave way to shrubland and then to near desert, Homo erectus adapted. They found the water sources, they exploited the scarce resources, they survived. Professor Julio Mercader, the lead researcher, put it bluntly. The conventional models were wrong. Computer simulations of hominin ecology, the ones that predicted early humans couldn't survive in deserts, were based on assumptions that this new evidence contradicts. Homo erectus was more adaptable than anyone realized, more capable, more resilient, but the desert adaptation is only part of the story. Because while some Homo erectus populations were figuring out how to survive extreme heat and drought, others were doing something equally impressive at the opposite extreme. 2 million years ago, in the highlands of Ethiopia, at elevations over 6,000 feet, a child died. Any of the 1,000 dangers that threatened Stone Age humans. What matters is what happened next. The body was buried or covered relatively quickly, protected from scavengers, and over millions of years, the jaw and teeth fossilized, preserved in volcanic sediments until Italian and Ethiopian archaeologists found them in 1981. For decades, this fossil, nicknamed Little Garber, was studied and debated. Some researchers thought it might be Homo habilis. Others suggested Homo rudolfensis. The anatomy was difficult to interpret. The dating was uncertain. The fossil sat in collections, important but not definitive, another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit anywhere. Then, in 2023, scientists used cutting-edge imaging technology, synchrotron radiation that can see inside fossils without damaging them, high-resolution scans that reveal internal structures invisible to the naked eye, and they compared Little Garber's teeth in unprecedented detail to other early Homo species. The conclusion: Homo erectus, dated to 2 million years ago, making this one of the earliest examples of the species, living not in the warm lowlands where scientists expected them, not in the savanna where the conventional models placed them, but at high altitude in a cool, challenging mountain environment. 6,000 feet of elevation doesn't sound extreme to modern humans. We build cities at that altitude: Denver, Addis Ababa, Bogota. But for early hominins without fire, without insulated clothing, without the ability to store food for cold periods, your body has to work harder to get oxygen. Temperatures swing wildly. Hot during the day, potentially freezing at night. Food resources are different. The plants and animals aren't the same species that live in lowland environments. And yet, there they were, 2 million years ago, making tools, both simple Oldowan flakes and more sophisticated Acheulean hand axes, processing food, surviving, at an altitude that should have been beyond their capabilities. The researcher Margarita Musi described their adaptability as unprecedented. These weren't hominins restricted to narrow ecological niches. These were generalists, capable of exploiting diverse environments, capable of learning new landscapes, capable of surviving conditions that would have killed populations without that flexibility. This pattern repeats across the Homo erectus range. In China, fossils have been found in environments that were temperate during interglacial periods, but would have been bitterly cold during ice ages. In Java, they lived through massive volcanic eruptions that would have devastated local ecosystems. Wet phases and dry phases alternating over thousands of years. Each of these environmental challenges would have required adaptation, behavioral flexibility, the ability to change strategies when conditions changed. And Homo erectus had it. They weren't locked into one way of doing things. They could shift their diet when familiar foods became scarce. They could move to new locations when old ones became uninhabitable. They could develop new tool types when circumstances required it. This ecological flexibility is now recognized as one of the key factors in Homo erectus longevity. They survived for nearly 2 million years because they could handle change, because they weren't specialists dependent on specific conditions. They were generalists who could make do with whatever was available. Think about what this means in practical terms. A Homo erectus band living in coastal East Africa would have known how to gather shellfish, fish in tidal pools, hunt small game, collect bird eggs, dig for roots and tubers. If the climate dried out and the coastline receded, they'd shift to different resources, follow animal migrations inland, learn which desert plants held water, find the reliable springs and water holes. Another population living in the Ethiopian highlands would have completely different knowledge. Which mountain plants were edible, which animals could be hunted at altitude, how to predict weather patterns, where to shelter during storms, how to stay warm during cold nights. But the underlying capability, the cognitive flexibility to learn and adapt, that was the same. This is radically different from how we think about most extinct species. Usually, when a species goes extinct, it's because they were too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions that disappeared. Giant pandas eating almost nothing but bamboo. Koalas feeding exclusively on eucalyptus. When those resources vanish, the species can't adapt fast enough. They die out. But Homo erectus was the opposite. They were the survivors, precisely because they weren't locked in. They could eat almost anything, live almost anywhere, adapt to almost any challenge. This made them incredibly resilient to environmental change. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. They achieved this flexibility with Stone Age technology, with brains smaller than ours, without writing to transmit knowledge across generations, without metal tools, without agriculture, without any of the technologies we consider essential for surviving in extreme environments. How? The answer seems to be social learning, the ability to observe others and copy successful behaviors. If one individual figures out how to crack open a particular type of nut, others can watch and learn. If someone discovers a reliable water source, that knowledge can be shared with the group. Over time, populations build up detailed ecological knowledge about their specific environment, knowledge that's passed from parents to children, from experienced adults to younger members of the band. This kind of cultural transmission doesn't require language as complex as ours. Even modern great apes can learn from each other. Young chimpanzees watch their mothers use tools and gradually acquire the skill through observation and practice. Homo erectus, with larger brains and more sophisticated cognition, would have been even better at this. They could accumulate knowledge, build on what previous generations had learned, develop complex strategies for surviving in their specific environments. But social learning alone doesn't explain everything, because Homo erectus wasn't just surviving in diverse environments. They were actively seeking them out. They were expanding into new territories, pushing into regions where no hominin had gone before. This requires more than just flexibility. It requires something like curiosity, exploration, a willingness to take risks and see what's over the next hill. Some researchers think this exploratory behavior might have been driven by population pressure. As Homo erectus populations grew in favorable areas, competition for resources would have increased. Young adults, finding it difficult to secure territory in established ranges, would have had incentive to explore new areas, to take their chances in unknown environments rather than compete with established groups. Others suggest climate variability itself created selection pressure for exploration. When conditions in one area became difficult, groups that were willing to move, to seek new territories, would have had survival advantages over groups that stayed put and struggled with degraded resources. Either way, the result was the same. Homo erectus spread, from Africa into Asia, from tropical lowlands to temperate highlands, from coastal areas to inland regions. Wherever they went, they adapted, learned the local ecology, figured out how to survive, and then persisted in those new environments for hundreds of thousands of years. The strategic use of landscape features is particularly impressive. The 2025 study from Oldupai showed that during desert periods, Homo erectus populations consistently settled near river confluences. This isn't random. River confluences are reliable. Even during droughts, water persists longer where two watercourses meet. Attracts more animals. This kind of strategic site selection requires understanding. You need to know how water behaves in the landscape, need to be able to predict where resources will be most reliable during difficult periods, need to plan ahead. These aren't the cognitive abilities of a primitive, barely capable hominin. This is sophisticated ecological knowledge. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In China, Homo erectus sites are often located near springs or along river terraces. In Java, they occupied coastal areas with access to both marine and terrestrial resources. In the Levant, they used caves that provided natural shelter and controlled access to water sources. Everywhere they went, they chose locations strategically, maximizing resource access while minimizing risk. And they made tools appropriate to their environments. In regions with good quality stone, they made elaborate Acheulean hand axes, large, carefully shaped tools that required significant skill and planning to produce. In regions where good stone was scarce, they made simpler tools but used them effectively. They adapted their technology to available materials. There's even evidence they were exploiting seasonal resources, following animal migrations, timing their movements to coincide with fruiting seasons of important plants. This requires understanding temporal patterns, knowing when things happen, having a sense of seasonal cycles. Again, not primitive behavior, sophisticated planning. What we're seeing is a species that was cognitively capable of handling complexity, that could learn from experience, that could adapt strategies to changing conditions, that could plan ahead, and critically, that could do all of this consistently enough to survive for nearly 2 million years across radically different environments. This challenges fundamental assumptions about human cognitive evolution. We tend to think of modern humans as uniquely capable, uniquely flexible. The assumption has been that earlier hominins were more limited, more constrained, that the big expansion in behavioral flexibility, the human revolution, happened relatively recently, maybe 50,000 years ago, maybe 100,000, connected to the evolution of modern human brain size and complexity. But Homo erectus is forcing researchers to reconsider. Maybe behavioral flexibility evolved much earlier than we thought. Maybe the cognitive toolkit that allows humans to survive anywhere, to adapt to anything, wasn't unique to Homo sapiens. Maybe we inherited it from ancestors who had already been using it successfully for well over 1 million years. This doesn't mean Homo erectus was identical to us cognitively. They clearly weren't. The archaeological record shows differences. Less innovation in tool types, less evidence of symbolic behavior, less artistic expression. But the core ability to learn, to adapt, to solve novel problems, to survive in diverse conditions, that was already present, already working, already proven over vast stretches of time. And this is what makes their eventual extinction so puzzling. A species this adaptable, this capable, this proven over nearly 2 million years, what could possibly have caused them to finally disappear? What challenge were they unable to meet after successfully meeting thousands of challenges before? The answer, as we'll see, may lie not in their limitations but in their success, in the very adaptability that allowed them to spread so widely. Because sometimes being everywhere means being vulnerable when conditions change everywhere at once. Picture East Africa 2 million years ago. Homo erectus has just evolved. They're there on the landscape alongside other hominins. Homo habilis, Paranthropus, boisei, multiple human and human-like species coexisting, competing for resources, carving out their ecological niches. And then something happens. Something that had never happened before. In hominin evolution, Homo erectus leaves. Not just moves to a new valley. Not just follows a migrating herd a few dozen miles. Leaves Africa entirely. Crosses into Asia. And they do it fast. Within a couple 100,000 years of first appearing in the African fossil record, Homo erectus is already in Georgia, that small country wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. We know this because of an extraordinary site called Dmanisi. Dmanisi is a small town in southern Georgia, about 50 miles from the capital Tbilisi. In the early 1990s, archaeologists excavating a medieval fortress noticed something strange. Beneath the medieval layers were much older deposits, and in those deposits were bones. The dating was shocking. 1.85 million years ago, maybe as early as 1.88 million. This made Dmanisi one of the oldest hominin sites outside of Africa. And the fossils preserved there are remarkable. Multiple individuals, adults and adolescents. Enough to show variation within the population. Enough to tell us what these early migrants looked like. And they looked different from what many scientists expected. They were small, some individuals barely 5 feet tall. Lightly built, their brains were on the smaller end of the Homo erectus range, around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. Their skulls showed a mix of primitive and derived features. They didn't look like the classic Java man or Peking man specimens that most people associate with Homo erectus. They looked earlier, more variable, almost transitional. This raises an obvious question. What were they doing in Georgia? How did they get there? And more fundamentally, why did they leave Africa at all? For millions of years, hominins had stayed in Africa. Australopithecus, Paranthropus, early Homo, all of them evolved in Africa and remained in Africa. The continent had everything they needed: diverse habitats, abundant resources, familiar dangers. Then Homo erectus appears, and within what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink, they're on another continent. Something changed. Something made them willing or able to expand beyond the boundaries that had confined their ancestors. One theory is that it wasn't a choice. Wet periods and dry periods alternating more rapidly. Ice ages beginning to dominate the planet's climate cycles. In Africa, this meant expanding grasslands, shrinking forests, more unpredictable rainfall. Populations living near the edges of favorable habitat might have been forced to move as conditions changed, and once moving, they kept going. But this doesn't quite explain the pattern, because Homo erectus didn't just spread into marginal areas near Africa. They went all the way to Indonesia, all the way to northern China. These aren't desperate populations being pushed into unsuitable habitats. These are successful colonizations. Populations that arrived in new environments and thrived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Another theory focuses on their improved body plan. Those long legs, that efficient walking gait. Maybe Homo erectus was simply better at traveling than earlier hominins. And once you can walk further each day, once you have the endurance to trek for weeks across unfamiliar landscapes, the world opens up. Deserts, rivers. You can cross them. A third possibility is cognitive. Maybe Homo erectus was the first hominin smart enough to handle the challenges of migration, smart enough to read landscapes they'd never seen before, to find food in unfamiliar environments, to adapt their behavior when usual strategies didn't work. This intelligence, combined with their physical capabilities, made them uniquely suited for expansion. Or maybe it was all of these things together. Climate creating pressure, body plan providing capability, cognition enabling adaptation. A perfect storm of factors that turned Homo erectus into the first hominin able to successfully leave Africa and establish populations elsewhere. The route they took is still debated. The most likely path is through the Levant, that narrow corridor of land connecting Africa to Asia through modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. During periods of favorable climate, this region would have been accessible, a land bridge with enough resources to support migrating populations. From there, they could have spread northeast into the Caucasus, reaching Georgia, or southeast into Arabia and then onward to Asia. Some researchers argue for multiple dispersal events, that Homo erectus left Africa not once but several times. Early waves around 2 million years ago, later waves bringing populations with slightly different characteristics. This could explain the variation we see between African, Georgian, and Asian Homo erectus. They weren't all descended from a single founding population. They represent multiple migrations at different times. But here's where the mystery deepens. Because Homo erectus didn't just reach mainland Asia. They reached islands. Flores in Indonesia, Luzon in the Philippines, possibly Crete in the Mediterranean, though this evidence is more controversial. And to reach these islands, they would have needed to cross open water. Flores is particularly interesting. The island has never been connected to the Asian mainland, not even during ice ages when sea levels dropped dramatically. There has always been a water gap, not huge, maybe 10 to 15 miles at the narrowest, but significant, deep enough that you can't wade across, wide enough that you can't see the other side on a clear day. To get to Flores, Homo erectus would have needed boats, or rafts, some kind of watercraft. The earliest evidence of Homo erectus on Flores dates to around 1 million years ago, possibly earlier. This is hundreds of thousands of years before we have any definitive evidence of boat building anywhere else. The oldest confirmed boats discovered by archaeologists are maybe 10,000 years old. Yet here's Homo erectus on an island they could only have reached by water, almost 1 million years ago. Did they build boats? The idea seems almost impossible. Boat building requires planning, understanding of water, ability to gather and process materials, capability to construct something that will float and be stable enough to survive ocean crossings. These are sophisticated cognitive abilities, skills that many researchers assumed only modern humans possessed. The alternative explanation is natural rafting. that Homo erectus individuals were accidentally swept out to sea on floating vegetation during storms, that they survived the crossing by sheer luck and managed to establish breeding populations on the islands where they landed. This requires fewer cognitive abilities, but relies heavily on chance. Would enough individuals survive random rafting events to found viable populations? Would they include both males and females of breeding age? Would they carry the genetic diversity needed for long-term survival? Some researchers argue yes, that over hundreds of thousands of years, rare rafting events could have successfully transported small founding populations to multiple islands. Others remain skeptical, point out that intentional seafaring, even using simple watercraft, makes more sense than relying on accidents. The evidence doesn't give us a clear answer. We have stone tools on islands. We have Homo erectus fossils on islands. We don't have preserved boats. We don't have cave paintings showing boat construction. We don't have archaeological sites with evidence of maritime technology. We have the result of water crossings without understanding the method. And this pattern, frustratingly, repeats throughout the study of Homo erectus migration. We can see where they went. We can date approximately when they arrived. But we can't fully explain how they did it. Can't reconstruct the cognitive processes that allowed them to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Can't identify the social structures that organized and sustained long-distance movements. Can't determine whether migrations were planned expeditions or gradual range expansions following resources. What we do know is that once Homo erectus populations established themselves in new regions, they stayed. The fossil record from Java shows continuous occupation for over 1 million years. From about 1.6 million years ago until around 100,000 years ago, Homo erectus lived on this island. That's longer than our entire species has existed. That's hundreds of thousands of generations in the same geographic area. China shows similar patterns. Homo erectus appears there by around 1.7 million years ago, and they persist until at least 300,000 years ago, maybe later. Again, massive temporal depth, enormous continuity. This wasn't just passing through, this was permanent settlement. But here's what's strange. Despite this long occupation of Asian territories, Homo erectus populations seem to have remained relatively isolated from each other. African populations, Asian populations, they evolved somewhat independently. The skulls from China look different from the skulls from Java. The tools from different regions show local traditions. There's variation that suggests limited gene flow between distant populations. This makes sense geographically. Asia is huge. Populations in Indonesia were separated from populations in China by thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The Himalayas forming a massive barrier, deserts limiting movement, dense forests channeling migration routes. Even with their walking ability, even with their adaptability, Homo erectus populations couldn't maintain constant contact across such vast distances. So instead of one global Homo erectus population, what we see is a species fractured into regional groups, each adapting to local conditions, each developing their own traditions and characteristics, united by shared ancestry and similar body plans, but diverging over hundreds of thousands of years of separation. This fragmentation might explain some of the confusion in the fossil record. Some researchers argue that Asian Homo erectus should be classified as a separate species, Homo erectus sensu stricto, distinct from African populations, which they call Homo ergaster. Others lump them all together as Homo erectus sensu lato, one highly variable species spread across multiple continents. The debate isn't just semantic. It reflects genuine uncertainty about how connected these populations were, about whether they could have interbred if they encountered each other, about whether the differences we see represent species-level divergence or just regional variation within a single species. And there's another mystery. Why didn't Homo erectus reach Europe? Or if they did, why is the evidence so scarce and controversial? We have solid evidence of them in Africa and Asia. The Georgian fossils show they got to the edge of Europe. But further west, into the European peninsula, the evidence becomes ambiguous. Some sites in Spain and Italy from around 1 million years ago have been attributed to Homo erectus. But the fossils are fragmentary. The dating is sometimes questionable. Many researchers think these might represent later hominin species that arrived in Europe after Homo erectus. Descended from Homo erectus populations but not quite Homo erectus themselves. If Homo erectus could reach Indonesia, if they could cross water to islands, why not Europe? The geography isn't more challenging. The climate during warm periods would have been suitable. Was there some barrier we don't understand? Some ecological factor that prevented successful colonization? Or have we simply not found the right sites yet? Is European Homo erectus waiting in sediments that haven't been excavated? These questions matter because they affect how we understand Homo erectus ecology and behavior. Were they truly capable of living anywhere? Or were there environmental limits we haven't identified? Were their migrations strategic, targeted toward favorable habitats, or opportunistic, going wherever chance and circumstance led them? The migration of Homo erectus represents one of the most successful range expansions in mammalian history. From a single origin point in Africa, they spread across 3 continents and numerous islands. They occupied tropical rainforests and temperate grasslands, coastal plains and high plateaus. They survived ice ages and interglacials, volcanic eruptions and climate swings, and they did all of this with Stone Age technology and brains smaller than ours. How? The answer seems to be that they were pioneers, willing to explore, able to adapt, capable of learning new environments quickly enough to survive the transition. This pioneering spirit, this willingness to move into unfamiliar territory, it's written into their geographic distribution, into the thousands of miles between their earliest African fossils and their latest Indonesian remains. But pioneering has costs. When you spread yourself across multiple continents, when you fracture into isolated populations, you become vulnerable in new ways. Because if conditions change everywhere simultaneously, there's nowhere left to go. No refuge population to recolonize empty habitats. And that vulnerability, that consequence of their success, may be part of why Homo erectus eventually disappeared. There's a skull in a museum in Georgia that tells a story more powerful than almost any other fossil in the human record. It belonged to an old individual, a Homo erectus who lived at Dmanisi about 1.77 million years ago. And when researchers examined it closely, they discovered something remarkable. This person had lost all but one of their teeth. Not recently, years before death, maybe decades. The bone had resorbed where the teeth had been. The jaw had reshaped itself. This wasn't someone who died shortly after losing their teeth. This was someone who survived, toothless, for a significant portion of their adult life. Think about what that means. 1.77 million years ago. No dentistry. No soft processed foods from agriculture. No blenders or food processors. Just Stone Age tools and whatever you could hunt or gather. And this individual, unable to chew, survived. How? The only answer that makes sense is that other people helped them. That someone, probably multiple someones, was preparing food for this person, chewing it perhaps, pounding it soft with stones, sharing pre-processed portions that could be gummed or swallowed without functional teeth. This is care. This is compassion. This is evidence of social bonds strong enough that a group would support a member who could no longer contribute fully to their own survival. This is the earliest clear evidence we have of group care in the hominin fossil record. Not the earliest that probably existed. Almost certainly other species cared for sick and injured members. Chimpanzees and other great apes show altruistic behavior, but this is the earliest we can prove it from physical evidence. And it tells us something profound about Homo erectus' social complexity. They lived in groups. Had to have. A solitary Homo erectus wouldn't survive long. Too many predators. Too many dangers. Humans are social primates, and that goes back deep into our evolutionary history. But the Dmanisi skull shows us that these groups weren't just individuals tolerating each other's presence. They were cooperating, supporting each other, making decisions to help members who needed it. But beyond this one extraordinary case, the social lives of Homo erectus are largely invisible to us. We have their bones. We have their tools. We have the places where they lived. But social behavior doesn't fossilize. Relationships don't leave traces in stone. We're left inferring, guessing, building hypotheses on fragmentary evidence and comparisons with modern primates. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Homo erectus lived in small groups, probably 20 to 50 individuals, maybe less during difficult times, maybe more when resources were abundant. This is based on modern hunter-gatherer band sizes and what we know about the carrying capacity of ancient landscapes. These groups would have had structure, not the complex hierarchies of modern human societies, no chiefs or formal leaders, but social dynamics nonetheless. Older individuals with knowledge and experience, younger adults doing the physical labor of hunting and gathering, children learning from their elders, relationships between individuals based on kinship, cooperation, reciprocity. The evidence for cooperation is indirect but compelling. Homo erectus made Acheulean hand axes, those carefully shaped stone tools that required significant skill. Young individuals would have learned this skill by watching older, experienced toolmakers. This is social learning, observation and imitation. It requires tolerance, an expert willing to let a novice watch and practice, a social environment where knowledge transmission is valued. They also hunted, or at least scavenged, large animals. We find their tools associated with the bones of elephants, hippos, large bovids. Processing a hippo carcass isn't a solo activity. It requires multiple people working together. Butchering, transporting meat, defending the kill from other scavengers. Fire, when they had it, would have been a social focus. Archaeological sites from later periods show hearths surrounded by tools and debris. People gathered around fires, worked there, ate there, maybe slept nearby for warmth and protection. The fire becomes the center of social life, the place where the group comes together. But here's what we don't know. We don't know if they had language, not human language as we understand it. The vocal apparatus required for the full range of human speech probably evolved later, but some form of communication beyond simple grunts and gestures? Almost certainly, you can't coordinate a hunt, can't teach tool-making, can't maintain complex social relationships without some way to communicate detailed information. Maybe they had a proto-language, simple words or sounds for important concepts. Water, danger, food, animal names. Combining these in basic ways to convey more complex ideas. This would be enough to function. Enough to transmit knowledge. Enough to organize group activities. Not enough to tell stories or discuss abstract concepts, but enough to survive and cooperate. The structure of Homo erectus brains provides some clues. The areas associated with language in modern humans, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, they're in the frontal and temporal lobes. And Homo erectus skulls show expansion in these regions compared to earlier hominins. Not as much expansion as in modern humans, but enough to suggest that the neural hardware for more sophisticated communication was developing. Some researchers argue that the vocal control needed for language was already present in Homo erectus, that the descended larynx, the changes in the vocal tract that allow modern humans to produce the range of sounds we use for speech, these might have evolved earlier than we think. The evidence is ambiguous. Soft tissue doesn't fossilize. We're reconstructing vocal anatomy from bone alone, which is uncertain. What about symbolic thought? The ability to think in abstractions? This is harder to assess because it leaves even fewer traces than communication ability. There is one tantalizing piece of evidence. A shell from Java, found at a Homo erectus site dated to around 500,000 years ago. Deliberate engravings, zigzag patterns that required careful, controlled movements to create. Someone made these marks intentionally. But why? Were they decorative? Evidence of aesthetic sense? Or were they functional? Perhaps marks to count something, track something, record information in a simple way? We can't tell. The marks exist. The intention behind them is lost. This shell is important because it pushes back the timeline for symbolic behavior. Before its discovery, researchers generally thought symbolic thought, the kind required for art and decoration, only emerged with modern humans. Maybe 300,000 years ago at the earliest. But here's Homo erectus, 500,000 years ago, making deliberate marks on an object that served no obvious functional purpose. The shell wasn't a tool, wasn't food. The engravings didn't make it more useful. They were just there. Made because someone wanted to make them. Group size in Homo erectus would have had important implications for social complexity. With 20 to 50 individuals, everyone knows everyone else. You remember past interactions. Know who's reliable, who shares food, who helps during difficult times, who takes without giving back. This creates opportunities for reciprocal relationships. I help you today. You help me tomorrow. Over time, these exchanges build social bonds. But groups this size also create challenges. Conflicts arise. Resources are sometimes scarce. Mates are limited. Without language complex enough for negotiation, without formal rules or authority structures, how did Homo erectus groups manage conflict? Modern chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, handle conflict through dominance hierarchies. The strongest, most aggressive individuals get priority access to resources and mates. But they also have reconciliation behaviors. After conflicts, individuals who fought will reconcile through grooming, sharing food, physical contact. Homo erectus probably had similar patterns. Some aggression, competition for status, but also mechanisms to restore social harmony after conflicts, because groups that couldn't manage internal conflicts would fragment, would split into smaller units, and smaller units would be more vulnerable to predators, environmental challenges, competition with other groups. The thick skulls of Homo erectus, which we mentioned earlier as a mystery, might be relevant here. If interpersonal violence was common, if conflicts sometimes escalated to physical confrontation, thick skulls would be protective, would reduce the risk of fatal head trauma during fights. This doesn't mean Homo erectus society was unusually violent, just that, like all primates, they probably had aggressive interactions, and the species evolved to survive them. The evidence from Dmanisi, where we have multiple individuals from the same population, shows variation in physical characteristics. Others smaller, more gracile. This could reflect sexual dimorphism. Males on average bigger than females. In modern primates, high sexual dimorphism often correlates with intense male competition for mates. Larger males able to dominate smaller ones. If this pattern held for Homo erectus, their social structure might have involved competition between males for access to females. But again, we're speculating. The fossil record shows variation. It doesn't tell us definitively about mating systems or social hierarchies. What about children? Homo erectus children would have required extended care. Human infants are helpless for years. They need to be carried, fed, protected. This is metabolically expensive. A mother with a young infant can't hunt effectively, can't gather food as efficiently. This creates pressure for cooperative child rearing, not just mothers caring for their own children, but aunts, grandmothers, older siblings helping. This is called alloparental care, and it's common in modern humans. It might have deep roots in Homo erectus social systems. Groups that shared child-rearing responsibilities would have higher infant survival rates, would produce more offspring who survived to adulthood, would pass on their cooperative tendencies to the next generation. The growth rate of Homo erectus children provides some evidence here. Studies of tooth formation suggest they grew faster than modern human children, more like chimpanzees. This means shorter dependency periods, less extended childhood, less time requiring intensive care, but still longer than other mammals. Extended juvenile periods also create opportunities for learning. Young Homo erectus had years to practice tool-making, to learn about local plants and animals, to develop hunting skills. This learning period would have been social, children watching adults, trying to copy their behaviors, getting feedback and instruction. The transmission of tool-making knowledge across hundreds of thousands of years, the stability of the Acheulean tradition, this suggests effective social learning. Each generation learning from the previous one, maintaining techniques and passing them forward. This requires patience from teachers, motivation in learners. A social environment where this transmission is valued and supported. But here's what haunts researchers. All these social capabilities, all this evidence of cooperation and care and learning, It exists alongside long periods where Homo erectus technology barely changed. The Acheulean hand axe tradition persists for over 1 million years with minimal innovation. The same basic tool design used across vast geographic ranges and enormous timescales. Does this mean Homo erectus lacked the creativity for innovation? Or does it mean they achieved an optimal design early on and saw no reason to change it? Modern humans, when we find a technology that works, we often stick with it. The wheel hasn't fundamentally changed in thousands of years. Neither has the knife. Maybe hand axes were the same. Good enough. Effective for their purposes. Not needing improvement. Or maybe the social systems of Homo erectus were conservative. Maybe there was pressure to conform to group traditions, to make tools the way your parents did, the way everyone else did. Innovation might have been discouraged socially, seen as risky, strange, different. We can't know. The archaeological record shows technological conservatism. It doesn't tell us whether this resulted from cognitive limitations or social choices, or the simple fact that the technology worked and didn't need changing. What we do know is that Homo erectus' social capabilities were sophisticated enough to support populations across 3 continents for nearly 2 million years. To coordinate hunts, to transmit knowledge, to maintain group cohesion, to raise children successfully, to survive challenges that killed species with larger brains and supposedly superior cognitive abilities. Their social lives remain largely mysterious. We catch glimpses: the toothless elder at Dmanisi, the engraved shell from Java, the carefully made hand axes that required social learning to produce. But these are fragments, shadows, evidence that something complex was happening, but not enough to reconstruct the full picture. We don't know what they called each other, if they had names. Don't know what sounds they made around fires at night. Don't know what they thought about the stars or storms, or the bones of huge animals they found eroding from hillsides. Don't know if they mourned their dead or simply left them where they fell. Don't know if they told stories or sang or had any sense of past and future beyond the immediate present. These social ghosts, these behaviors and thoughts and relationships that don't preserve, they're the biggest gap in our understanding of Homo erectus. We know they had rich social lives, know they cooperated and communicated and cared for each other. But the details, the actual experience of being Homo erectus in a Homo erectus group, that's lost to time, forever beyond our reach unless we develop technologies to extract information from sources we haven't imagined yet. What remains is evidence of success. A species that lived socially, that raised children who survived to have children, that maintained groups stable enough to persist in the same regions for hundreds of thousands of years. That spread across the world and adapted to countless environments. Whatever their social systems were, whatever their relationships and hierarchies and ways of being together, they worked. Hold a stone in your hand, any stone. Feel its weight, its texture, the way it sits in your palm. Now imagine taking another stone and striking the first one, not randomly, with precision, at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force, removing a flake that's sharp enough to cut through hide, through flesh, through tendon and ligament. This is knapping, the art of making stone tools, and Homo erectus mastered it to a degree that still impresses archaeologists today. Their signature tool is the Acheulean hand axe. The name comes from Saint-Acheulean in France, where these tools were first identified in the 19th century. But Homo erectus was making them across Africa and Asia for over 1 million years. The design is distinctive. A teardrop or almond shape flaked on both sides, what archaeologists call bifacial, carefully thinned to create sharp edges all around, sized to fit comfortably in the hand. Making one requires skill. You start with a large cobble or core of suitable stone, flint, obsidian, quartzite, chert, materials that fracture predictably when struck. You assess the stone. Look for flaws, cracks, inclusions that might cause it to break wrong. You plan your strikes. Each flake removed changes the shape, creates new angles, new possibilities and constraints. A skilled modern knapper can make a decent hand axe in maybe 20 minutes. But that's after years of practice, after thousands of hours learning how stone behaves. How to control the angle of impact. How much force to use. Where to strike to remove the flake you want. It's not easy. Most people trying for the first time produce garbage, broken cores, flakes that are too thick or wrong-shaped or useless. Homo erectus children would have watched their parents making these tools, picked up discarded cores, tried to copy what they saw, failed repeatedly. Gradually, over months and years, developed the muscle memory and understanding needed to produce serviceable tools. The best tool makers, the ones with natural talent and extensive practice, would have produced the finest examples. Perfectly symmetrical, beautifully thinned, sharp enough to shave with, and they made millions of them. Literally millions. Acheulean hand axes are one of the most common artifacts in the archaeological record from between 1.7 million and 300,000 years ago. You find them in Africa, India, the Middle East, parts of Europe, anywhere Homo erectus lived for extended periods, concentrated at sites where they processed food, scattered across ancient landscapes, where individuals lost or discarded them. Each one represents effort, time, skill. That would allow them to butcher animals too tough to tear with bare hands, to dig roots from hard ground, to process plant materials, to defend against predators maybe, to shape wood for other tools. But here's the paradox that puzzles archaeologists. These tools barely changed for over 1 million years. Early Acheulean hand axes from 1.7 million years ago look remarkably similar to late Acheulean hand axes from 700,000 years ago. 1 million years, thousands of generations, and the basic design remains stable. Same shape, same size range, same manufacturing technique. Some researchers see this as evidence of cognitive limitations. They argue that Homo erectus reached a ceiling in their cognitive abilities. They could learn the hand axe technique, could execute it skillfully, but couldn't innovate beyond it, couldn't imagine different designs, couldn't experiment with new approaches. The conservative technology reflected conservative minds, brains that could copy and repeat but not create something genuinely new. Others argue the opposite, that the stability represents optimal design, that Homo erectus quickly figured out what worked and stuck with it because there was no reason to change. The hand axe was effective, versatile, could be used for multiple purposes, made from locally available materials, easy enough to teach to children. Why innovate when what you have works perfectly well? Think about modern tools. A hammer hasn't fundamentally changed in thousands of years. Neither has the knife. Neither has the bowl. When a design works, when it's optimized for its purpose, there's no pressure to alter it. Maybe Acheulean hand axes were the same, the Stone Age equivalent of the hammer, a technology so good it didn't need improvement. There's also a third possibility, that we're misinterpreting the archaeological record, that Homo erectus was innovating, but in ways that don't preserve well. They might have made sophisticated tools from wood, from bamboo, from bone, organic materials that rot away. Only the stone survives, only the one technology that was durable enough to last millions of years. So we see stability in stone tools and assume that means no innovation anywhere. But maybe we're wrong. Maybe there was constant experimentation in perishable materials that we simply can't see. There is some evidence for this. At a few sites, archaeologists have found worked bone, animal bones modified into tools, pointed for digging or piercing, flattened for scraping. These are rare finds. Bone doesn't preserve as well as stone, but they suggest Homo erectus was capable of working multiple materials, of recognizing that different substances had different properties and uses. There's also increasing recognition that hand axes themselves show more variation than previously appreciated. When you look closely at thousands of examples, you see differences. Some populations made them longer and narrower, others wider and more ovate. Some were carefully refined with hundreds of tiny flakes removed. Others were rougher, more quickly made. This variation might reflect different uses, different raw materials, different skill levels among makers, or different cultural traditions in separated populations. The geographical distribution of Acheulean technology is interesting too. It's found across much of Africa, Western Asia, India, parts of Europe, but it's largely absent from East Asia. Homo erectus populations in China and Indonesia didn't make hand axes, or if they did, we haven't found them. Instead, they made simpler tools. Flakes struck from cores. Choppers, less standardized implements. Why? Some researchers think it's about raw materials. Maybe East Asian Homo erectus used bamboo extensively. Bamboo is incredibly useful. Strong, flexible, can be split and shaped into sharp implements. If you have access to good bamboo, you might not need elaborate stone tools. But bamboo doesn't fossilize, doesn't preserve. So East Asian Homo erectus looks technologically simpler than their Western relatives. But maybe they weren't. Maybe they just used different materials. Or maybe there really were cognitive differences between populations. Maybe the groups that left Africa earliest, before the Acheulean tradition was fully developed, never learned the technique. And once separated by thousands of miles, innovations in one population didn't spread to others. So African and Western Asian Homo erectus developed the hand axe tradition. Eastern Homo erectus developed different strategies. Both worked. Both supported successful populations for hundreds of thousands of years. The process of making an Acheulean hand axe tells us something important about Homo erectus cognition. It's not a simple task. You can't make one by accident. You can't just randomly strike stones together and end up with a symmetrical bifacial tool. Planning. Envisioning the finished product before you start. Holding a mental image of what you're trying to create. Sequential thinking. Understanding that this strike enables that strike. That you need to remove these flakes in this order to create the shape you want. Fine motor control, precision in your movements, ability to modulate force and angle strike by strike. Understanding of material properties. Knowledge of how different types of stone fracture. Ability to read the stone and predict how it will respond to impacts. Learning ability. Capacity to watch others and copy their techniques. To remember successful strategies and avoid mistakes. All of these are sophisticated cognitive abilities, not human-level cognition, not the full range of modern human thought, but impressive nonetheless, far beyond what earlier hominins were capable of. Evidence of minds that could plan, learn, and execute complex technical tasks. Some archaeologists have tried to recreate Acheulean hand axes while monitoring their own brain activity using scanning technology. They found that making these tools activates the same brain regions involved in language in modern humans, the same areas that light up when we speak or understand speech. This might not be coincidental. Both language and complex tool-making require sequential thinking, understanding of hierarchical structure, ability to break complex tasks into ordered steps. Maybe these cognitive abilities evolved together. Maybe learning to make hand axes and learning to communicate in more sophisticated ways were linked developments in Homo erectus evolution. But if Homo erectus had the cognitive capacity for complex tool-making, why didn't they innovate more? One answer might be social conservatism. In traditional societies, there's often strong pressure to do things the way they've always been done, the way your parents did them, the way your grandparents did them. Innovation can be seen as risky, wasteful. Why experiment when you have techniques that work? A young Homo erectus trying a new approach to tool-making might have been socially sanctioned, told to stick with tradition. Over thousands of generations, this conservative social pressure would maintain technological stability, even if individuals were capable of innovation. Another factor might be population size. Innovation often comes from large populations, with diverse individuals trying different approaches. But Homo erectus lived in small bands, maybe 20 to 50 people. With populations that small, the chances of someone having a genuinely innovative idea are low. And even if they do, that innovation might disappear when they die if it's not widely adopted by the group. Modern humans have innovation explosions when populations are large and well-connected. Ideas can spread, combine, build on each other. But Homo erectus populations were fragmented, separated by vast distances. Even if one group developed something new, there was no way for it to spread to others. This isolation would slow cultural evolution dramatically. There's also the possibility that we're judging Homo erectus innovation by the wrong standards. We assume that technological change is good, that more innovation means more intelligence. But maybe that's a modern bias. Maybe Homo erectus measured success differently, by survival, by stability, by maintaining traditions that connected them to their ancestors and gave them confidence in an uncertain world. They survived for nearly 2 million years. Our species, with all our innovation, has existed for maybe 300,000 years. Who's to say their approach wasn't actually superior? That rapid technological change isn't always advantageous? That sometimes the species that sticks with what works outlasts the ones constantly trying new things? These are uncomfortable questions for us. We like to think of human history as progress, as constant improvement, as a march toward ever greater complexity and capability. But Homo erectus challenges that narrative. They were complex enough, capable enough. They mastered their technology and their environment, and that mastery sustained them for a time span that makes our entire civilization look like a brief experiment. The tools they left behind, those millions of hand axes scattered across 3 continents, they're not just artifacts, they're evidence of minds at work, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next for thousands of generations, of a technological tradition so successful it became one of the longest lived in human history. And maybe that's the real story of Homo erectus innovation. Not that they failed to change, but that they succeeded so thoroughly with what they had that change became unnecessary. They found a technology that worked, a way of making tools that was effective, teachable, sustainable, and they stuck with it because it was enough. Enough to butcher animals, enough to process plants, enough to modify their environment, enough to spread across the world, enough to survive for nearly 2 million years. Sometimes enough is everything you need. 2 million years is an almost incomprehensible amount of time. Let that number sit for a moment. 2 million years. If you tried to count to 2 million, saying one number per second without stopping, it would take you 23 days. 23 days of continuous counting just to span the lifetime of a single species. During those 2 million years, the Earth changed in ways that would be unrecognizable. Ice ages came and went, not just once, dozens of times. Massive ice sheets advanced from the poles, covering entire continents in glaciers miles thick, then retreated, then advanced again. Land bridges appeared and disappeared, islands became peninsulas. The climate swung wildly. Warm periods saw tropical conditions extend far into what are now temperate zones. Cold periods brought tundra conditions to regions that are currently Mediterranean. Rainfall patterns shifted. Some areas that had been lush forests became deserts. Some deserts bloomed into grasslands. The planet was constantly changing. And through it all, Homo erectus survived. This is what makes them so remarkable. Not that they were the smartest, not that they had the best technology, but that they persisted. Through environmental chaos that killed countless other species, Homo erectus endured. Consider what they witnessed during their time on Earth. The Pleistocene epoch, which began about 2.6 million years ago, was a period of intense climate instability. The cycles of glaciation and warming became more extreme over time. Early in the Pleistocene, ice ages were relatively mild. Later ones were severe, but all of them would have created massive challenges for any species trying to survive. During glacial periods, fresh water was locked up in ice sheets. This made the climate drier globally, reduced rainfall, turned forests into grasslands, grasslands into semi-deserts. Water sources became scarce. Reliable springs and rivers were precious. The cold would have been deadly in regions far from the equator. Without fire, which Homo erectus may not have had reliably in their early existence, temperatures during glacial periods would have been fatal at higher latitudes. Even with fire, staying warm would have required constant effort, gathering fuel, maintaining flames, finding shelter. Then, during interglacial periods, warm periods between ice ages, conditions would reverse. Ice melted, sea levels rose. Coastal populations would have been forced to move inland as their territories flooded. The climate became wetter, forests expanded, animals and plants migrated, following their preferred habitats as temperature zones shifted poleward. Each transition would have required adaptation, learning new resources, developing new strategies, moving to new territories. For a species that lived in small, isolated bands, these transitions would have been existential threats. If conditions change too quickly, if too many individuals die before reproducing, the population can collapse entirely. But Homo erectus populations didn't collapse, at least not all of them. Not permanently. They bent, but didn't break. Part of their success was dietary flexibility. They weren't specialized feeders like pandas eating bamboo or koalas eating eucalyptus. They were omnivores. Opportunistic. They ate meat when they could get it. Hunted or scavenged depending on circumstances. They ate plant materials. Roots, tubers, fruits, seeds, nuts. They probably ate insects, shellfish if they lived near water, bird eggs, anything that provided calories. This flexibility meant they could switch food sources when conditions changed. If the large animals migrated away or went extinct, they could focus more on plant foods. If drought killed vegetation, they could rely more heavily on hunting. They weren't locked into one strategy, could adapt their subsistence patterns to available resources. Their tool technology, conservative as it was, gave them advantages. Stone tools allowed them to process foods that would otherwise be inedible. Tough plant materials could be pounded. Animal carcasses could be butchered efficiently. Bones could be broken to access nutritious marrow. Made them less vulnerable to scarcity in any single resource. Geographic distribution also helped. By spreading across 3 continents, Homo erectus effectively hedged their bets. If conditions in Africa became impossible, populations in Asia could survive. If Asian populations faced catastrophe, African populations persisted. This geographic fragmentation, which we discussed as a vulnerability earlier, was also a strength. It meant the species wasn't betting everything on one region, on one set of environmental conditions. But even with these advantages, survival for 2 million years is extraordinary. Most mammal species last maybe 1 to 2 million years before going extinct or evolving into something different. Homo erectus exceeded this. They persisted far longer than the typical mammalian species lifespan. Why? What made them special? One factor might be their generalist ecology. Unlike specialized species that depend on specific habitats or food sources, Homo erectus could live almost anywhere, could eat almost anything. This ecological flexibility meant they had more options when environments changed, more ways to adapt, more opportunities to survive. Another factor was their large geographic range. Species with wide distributions generally last longer than those with narrow ranges. If catastrophe strikes one region, populations elsewhere can survive and potentially recolonize the affected area later. Homo erectus, spread from Africa to Southeast Asia, had maximum geographic insurance against localized disasters. Their relatively large brain size compared to earlier hominins probably helped too. Bigger brains enabled better problem solving, better memory for resource locations, better ability to learn from experience and plan for future needs. When conditions changed, Homo erectus could think through responses rather than relying purely on instinct. Social cooperation was also crucial. Groups that worked together could accomplish things individuals couldn't. Could care for sick and injured members, maintaining group size even during difficult periods. Could coordinate hunts or defense against predators. This social safety net would have increased survival rates, allowed populations to persist through challenges that would have killed solitary individuals. But there's something else, something harder to quantify, a kind of resilience that goes beyond any single trait or adaptation. Homo erectus, as a species, demonstrated remarkable staying power. They didn't give up, didn't disappear when conditions got tough. They hung on, found ways to survive, adapted, persisted. This resilience is evident in the fossil record. During periods when we see other species going extinct, Homo erectus remains. They're present in sediments from glacial periods, from interglacials, under, from climate transitions, from volcanic eruption layers, from drought periods. They keep showing up, keep surviving, keep producing the next generation. There were surely close calls. Times when populations crashed, when only a few dozen or few hundred individuals survived in isolated refuges. Times when extinction seemed likely, but they recovered, rebuilt their numbers, spread out again when conditions improved. This pattern of persistence through adversity is a hallmark of generalist species. They might not be the best adapted to any particular environment. Specialists outcompete them when conditions are stable. But when environments change, when stability gives way to chaos, generalists have the edge. They can switch strategies, can exploit new resources, can survive where specialists can't adapt fast enough. Homo erectus was the ultimate generalist, not specialized for forests or grasslands, not specialized for hot or cold climates, not specialized for hunting or gathering. They could do it all. Could live anywhere, could eat anything, could adapt to whatever the world threw at them, and for nearly 2 million years this strategy worked. But resilience has limits. Adaptability has boundaries. No species survives forever. No matter how successful, no matter how widespread, no matter how flexible, eventually conditions change in ways that exceed a species' capacity to respond. For Homo erectus, that moment came around 100,000 years ago. After surviving for nearly 2 million years, after weathering countless ice ages and climate transitions, after spreading across 3 continents and adapting to environments from deserts to highlands to tropical islands, they started to disappear. In Africa, Homo erectus vanished first. The last clear evidence of them on the continent dates to around 500,000 years ago. After that, they're replaced by other hominin species. Homo heidelbergensis, early forms of Homo sapiens. Whether Homo erectus evolved into these species or was outcompeted by them is debated, but either way, classic Homo erectus disappears from Africa while the species persists elsewhere. In China, they lasted longer. Evidence suggests Homo erectus populations survived there until at least 300,000 years ago, maybe later. The dating of the latest Chinese sites is uncertain, but eventually they too disappeared, replaced by other human species or evolved into different forms. Java was their last refuge. The youngest confirmed Homo erectus fossils come from Gandong on the island of Java, dated to between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. These were the last of their kind, the final populations of a species that had dominated the human world for nearly 2 million years. What finally killed them? What environmental change was too great for Homo erectus to handle? The evidence points to rainforest expansion. Around 130,000 years ago, the climate in Java shifted. The open woodlands where Homo erectus had thrived for over 1 million years were replaced by dense tropical rainforest. This habitat change required different adaptations, different tools, different hunting strategies, different knowledge of plant resources. Rainforests are challenging environments for humans. The canopy blocks sunlight. The understory is dim. More seasonal. Tool materials might be different. The entire ecological package that Homo erectus had mastered no longer applied. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, can live in rainforests. We have populations throughout the Amazon, the Congo Basin, Southeast Asian jungles. Complex social organizations, detailed ecological knowledge, specific to rainforest environments. We've adapted our culture to handle rainforest challenges. Homo erectus, with their conservative technology and smaller brains, apparently couldn't make that leap, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the new conditions. Their populations declined, fragmented, and eventually went extinct. It's a sobering end for such a successful species. After surviving everything for so long, they were undone by a habitat shift, by rainforests spreading where open woodlands had been, by an environmental change that other human species would eventually adapt to, but which Homo erectus couldn't handle. There's no evidence they encountered modern humans. The dates don't overlap in Java. The last Homo erectus died out around 110,000 years ago. Modern humans didn't reach Java until around 73,000 years ago. 37,000 years too late for any meeting. So Homo erectus went extinct alone, not outcompeted by superior humans, not killed off by advancing populations, just unable to adapt to changing forests. A whimper of an ending for species whose reign had been so long and successful. But what a reign it was. 2 million years. Longer than any other human species has managed. 5 times longer than modern humans have existed. Through ice ages and warm periods, through volcanic eruptions and climate catastrophes, through droughts and floods, across 3 continents, in deserts and highlands and coastlands, they were the survivors, the ones who lasted when others didn't. The proof that you don't need the biggest brain or the fanciest technology to succeed. You need adaptability, resilience, the capacity to persist when times get tough. And Homo erectus had these qualities in abundance. Their extinction is a reminder that no survival strategy works forever. That conditions eventually change beyond any species' capacity to adapt. But their 2 million year success story is also a reminder that persistence pays. Sometimes they're just the ones who refuse to give up, who keep adapting, who keep trying, who keep surviving. Homo erectus was a survivor, the greatest survivor in human history, and we, their distant cousins, owe them respect for that. There's a riverbank in central Java where the story of Homo erectus comes to an end. The Solo River, flowing through what is now Indonesia, cutting through ancient sediments. And in those sediments, at a place called Ngandong, archaeologists in the 1930s found something remarkable and tragic: a dozen skulls, partial remains of the last Homo erectus. For decades, these fossils were difficult to date. The excavations happened before modern dating techniques existed. The original site context was unclear. Estimates for the age of the Ngandong skulls ranged wildly. Some researchers thought they might be 500,000 years old. Others suggested they could be as recent as 50,000 years. Then, in 2019, a team of researchers finally got the dates right. They determined that the Ngandong Homo erectus died between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. This date is crucial because it tells us several things. First, Homo erectus persisted on Java for over 1 million years, from about 1.6 million years ago until around 110,000 years ago, an extraordinarily long occupation of a single region, a testament to their success. But second, and more importantly, it tells us they were gone before modern humans arrived. Homo sapiens reached Java around 73,000 years ago. That's at least 35,000 years after the last known Homo erectus disappeared. The 2 species never overlapped in this region. There was no competition, no conflict, no interbreeding as far as we know. Homo erectus was already extinct when we arrived. This contradicts earlier theories that modern humans drove Homo erectus to extinction through direct competition. If we never encountered them, their extinction must have had other causes. And the geological evidence from Ngandong provides clues about what those causes might have been. The bone bed at Ngandong tells a violent story. The dozen Homo erectus individuals whose skulls were found there didn't die peacefully in one place. They died upstream. Their bodies were caught in a catastrophic flooding event. Monsoon rains, possibly following a volcanic eruption, created massive flows of water and mud. These flows picked up the bodies, transported them downstream, and deposited them at Ngandong where the river narrowed. This is why we only have skulls and a few other bones. The lighter cranial bones floated in the floodwaters, the heavier limb bones sank. Separated, scattered, lost. What washed up at Ngandong was what could float, a grim sorting by hydrodynamics. But the flooding event that killed these individuals wasn't what drove the species to extinction. That was just a local catastrophe. More pervasive, climate change. Around 130,000 years ago, the environment in Java began transforming. The climate became wetter, more humid. The open woodlands that had dominated the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years started giving way to dense tropical rainforest. The trees grew taller, thicker. The canopy closed. The understory became dim and tangled. This doesn't sound like a catastrophe. Trees replacing grassland. More forest. What's the problem? But for Homo erectus, this was an existential crisis. Because they weren't adapted for rainforests. Their entire toolkit, their entire way of life, was built around open woodland ecosystems. In open woodlands, you have visibility. You can see game animals, can track them across distances, can hunt cooperatively, using strategies that work in relatively open terrain. The plants you rely on grow in predictable patterns. Fruit trees that you can return to season after season. Tuber-bearing plants that you know where to find. Water sources that are accessible and obvious. Rainforests are different. The canopy blocks your view. Most animals live in the trees, not on the ground. The ones that are on the ground are wary, difficult to hunt. Plant resources are more dispersed, more seasonal. Trees, fruit, unpredictably. The plants that store energy in underground tubers might be different species requiring different processing techniques. Water is everywhere, but paradoxically harder to access in clean form. Modern humans can and do live in rainforests, but we've adapted our technology and knowledge specifically for these environments. We use blowguns and poisoned darts for hunting canopy animals. We have sophisticated plant knowledge, know which of the thousands of rainforest plant species are edible, which need processing to remove toxins. We've developed social networks that allow us to maintain populations even when resources are dispersed and unpredictable. Homo erectus didn't have these adaptations. Their Acheulean hand axes, so effective in open environments, weren't optimized for rainforest challenges. Their hunting strategies, developed over hundreds of thousands of years in savannas and woodlands, didn't transfer well. Their knowledge of plant resources, accumulated over countless generations, became obsolete when the species themselves changed. They could have adapted. In theory, other hominin species did. But adaptation takes time, takes innovative thinking, takes trial and error, and, critically, it takes surviving through the transition period. Takes maintaining population numbers while you figure out new strategies. Homo erectus populations in Java were probably already small by 130,000 years ago. Island populations have limited size based on available resources, and as the rainforests expanded, resources suitable for Homo erectus would have become scarcer. Their numbers would have declined. Groups would have become more isolated from each other. The genetic diversity needed for adaptation would have eroded. Small populations face multiple dangers. Inbreeding reduces fitness. Random events, a bad hunting season, a disease outbreak, a series of difficult births, can push numbers below the threshold for viability. Below the point where there are enough breeding pairs to sustain the population. This is called the extinction vortex. The Ngandong fossils might represent one of the last viable populations, or they might just be one group among several that were all struggling. We can't know because we haven't found other late Homo erectus sites in Java. Either they didn't exist, or they haven't been discovered yet, or they were destroyed by the same geological processes that preserved Ngandong. What we do know is that sometime around 100,000 years ago, Homo erectus disappeared from Java, and with Java being their last known refuge, this marks the extinction of the species globally. After nearly 2 million years, they were gone. It's tempting to see this as failure, a species that couldn't adapt, that became too specialized in their own way, that lost the flexibility that had made them successful for so long. But that's not quite right. Because Homo erectus succeeded for an extraordinary length of time, they outlasted every other human species except possibly us, and the jury's still out on whether we'll match their longevity. Their extinction wasn't failure. It was the inevitable end that comes to all species eventually. Conditions change, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but always beyond what any species can indefinitely track. The question isn't whether extinction happens, it's how long you last before it does. And Homo erectus lasted longer than almost anything. They survived climate swings that killed countless other species. They adapted to environments from deserts to highlands to tropical islands. They spread across 3 continents with Stone Age technology. They developed sophisticated social structures and passed knowledge across hundreds of thousands of generations. They raised children and cared for the elderly, and made tools and hunted and gathered and lived. For 2 million years, they lived. That's the story. Not their extinction, but their persistence, their resilience, their success in the face of constant environmental challenges. The rainforests that replaced Java's open woodlands were deadly for Homo erectus. But they weren't deadly because Homo erectus was weak or stupid or inadequate. They were deadly because adaptation has limits. Because no species can prepare for every possible future. Because being optimized for one set of conditions means being vulnerable when those conditions change fundamentally. Modern humans would eventually figure out rainforest living. But modern humans had larger brains, more complex technology, more sophisticated social organizations. And even we struggle in rainforests without extensive cultural knowledge, without tools specifically designed for those environments, without plants and hunting techniques adapted to the unique challenges. Homo erectus, with smaller brains and conservative technology, simply didn't have the cognitive or cultural resources to make the transition. Not inevitable, populations can sometimes surprise us with their adaptability. But here's what haunts researchers. If Homo erectus had survived another 50,000 years, if they'd hung on just a bit longer, they would have encountered modern humans, and that raises fascinating counterfactual questions. What would have happened? We know modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, with Denisovans. Their DNA persists in modern populations. Could we have interbred with Homo erectus? The species had been separated from our lineage for over 1 million years. That's a long time for reproductive incompatibility to evolve, but maybe not impossible. Maybe Homo erectus DNA could have entered our gene pool if the species had overlapped, or maybe we would have outcompeted them. Maybe our superior technology and larger brains would have given us decisive advantages. Maybe any encounter between Homo sapiens and Homo erectus would have ended badly for them. We'll never know. The species went extinct before any meeting could happen. And in some ways, that's fitting. Their story ended on their own terms, not defeated by superior humans, just unable to adapt to changing forests. The Solo River still flows through Java. The landscape where the last Homo erectus lived is now covered in cities and farms and roads. But the sediments remain. The fossils persist. Evidence of the final chapter of a species that rewrote what we thought possible for early humans. They showed us that you don't need modern brains to survive, don't need advanced technology, don't need agriculture or writing or civilization. You need adaptability, resilience, the capacity to learn and cooperate and persist. And for nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus had these qualities in abundance. Their extinction reminds us that survival is temporary, that success, no matter how long it lasts, eventually ends, that the environmental challenges that species face are relentless, unforgiving, always changing in ways that eventually exceed capacity to respond. But their 2 million year story reminds us of something else too. That persistence is possible, that resilience pays off, that even species we consider primitive can succeed on timescales that dwarf anything modern humans have achieved. That maybe, just maybe, the measures we use for success, technology, brain size, innovation, aren't the most important ones. Maybe what matters is staying power, the ability to keep going when conditions get tough, to adapt when necessary, to persist when easier to give up. And by that measure, Homo erectus was one of the most successful species in the entire history of life on Earth. They lasted. For an impossibly long time, they lasted, and that deserves respect. So here we are, at the end of a story that spans nearly 2 million years, a story about a species that shouldn't have been as successful as it was, that had smaller brains than us, simpler technology, less innovation, and yet persisted 5 times longer than our entire species has existed. What do we take from this? What does Homo erectus teach us about survival, about success, about what it means to make it in this world? The first lesson is humbling. We, Homo sapiens, like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the smartest species, the most adaptable, the ones who conquered the planet. And in some ways that's true. We've accomplished things no other species has, built civilizations, created art and science and culture of incredible complexity. But we've only been doing this for 300,000 years, maybe a bit less depending on how you define the origin of our species. That's remarkable. Impressive. But it's also a fraction of the time Homo erectus existed. We're newcomers, upstarts, the latest experiment in the human lineage. And the experiment is still running. We don't know yet if we'll last. Homo erectus lasted. For 1,900,000 years, they persisted. Through ice ages, through volcanic eruptions, through climate catastrophes that killed countless other species, they survived. And that survival, that sheer endurance, might be a more meaningful measure of success than any technological achievement. Think about what this means for how we understand intelligence and capability. We tend to equate bigger brains with better outcomes, more innovation with greater fitness. But Homo erectus challenges this. They had brains that averaged around 1,000 cubic centimeters, smaller than ours. They used the same basic stone tool technology for over 1 million years, with minimal changes. By our standards, they were cognitively limited, technologically stagnant, and yet they thrived. They spread across 3 continents. They adapted to environments from deserts to highlands to tropical islands. They survived climate swings that would test any species. They raised children and cared for the sick and cooperated in groups and transmitted knowledge across generations. They did everything necessary for evolutionary success. And they did it for an extraordinary length of time. This suggests that maybe our measures of success are wrong, or at least incomplete. Maybe what matters for long-term survival isn't constant innovation. Maybe it's finding strategies that work and sticking with them. Maybe it's being adaptable enough to handle environmental variation without being so specialized that you can't adjust when conditions change fundamentally. Maybe it's having the social structures to support your population through difficult times. Homo erectus had all of these things. They weren't the most innovative species, but they were resilient. They were flexible within limits. They were social and cooperative. They could learn and adapt and persist. And for nearly 2 million years, this package of traits was enough. Compare that to more recent human species. Neanderthals existed for maybe 400,000 years before going extinct. Denisovans, we don't even know exactly how long they lasted, but it was probably similar. Homo heidelbergensis, around 500,000 years. Complex technology in some cases. Evidence of sophisticated behavior. And all of them went extinct in a fraction of the time Homo erectus survived. Why? What made Homo erectus so much more durable than these later, supposedly more advanced species? Part of the answer is probably geographic range. Homo erectus spread farther and earlier than most other human species. This wide distribution meant that local extinctions, populations dying out in one region, didn't doom the species globally. Other populations could continue, could potentially recolonize areas where the species had disappeared. Geographic spread is insurance against catastrophe. Part of the answer is also ecological generalism. Homo erectus wasn't tied to specific resources or habitats. They could eat many different foods, live in many different environments. When conditions changed, they had options. Could move to new areas. Specialists excel in stable conditions but crash when those conditions disappear. Generalists do okay in many conditions. And okay is enough for survival. But there's something else, something harder to quantify. A kind of biological conservatism that might have actually been advantageous. Homo erectus didn't change much. Their body plan remained stable. Their technology remained stable. Their lifestyle, as far as we can tell, remained stable. This stability might have been a feature, not a bug. Rapid evolution can be risky. When a species is constantly changing, constantly adapting to new pressures, they can lose traits that seem useless in the current environment, but might be crucial when conditions change again. Stability. Maintaining a broad set of capabilities even when some aren't currently needed, provides buffer against unexpected changes. Homo erectus was stable. And that stability, combined with just enough flexibility to handle environmental variation, might have been the perfect combination for long-term survival. Not changing so fast that you lose important capabilities. Not so fixed that you can't adapt at all. A middle path. And that middle path sustained them for nearly 2 million years. Now, let's talk about us. Homo sapiens. We're facing our own period of rapid environmental change. Climate change driven by our own activities. habitat destruction, species extinctions. The question facing us is whether we can adapt fast enough to survive what's coming, whether our intelligence and technology will be enough to carry us through the challenges ahead. Homo erectus gives us both hope and warning. Hope, because they show that species can survive dramatic environmental changes, can persist through ice ages and climate swings, can adapt to new conditions when necessary. They did it for nearly 2 million years. It's possible, but also warning, because Homo erectus eventually did go extinct. After all that success, all that persistence, they encountered an environmental change they couldn't handle. The rainforests of Java expanded beyond their capacity to adapt, and that was the end. After 2 million years, they disappeared. We're creating our own environmental catastrophe, changing the climate faster than any natural process in hundreds of thousands of years, creating conditions that many species, including potentially us, won't be able to adapt to quickly enough. Homo erectus survived natural climate changes, but they took thousands of years to unfold. Our changes are happening in decades, in centuries at most. That's a completely different challenge. Can we adapt fast enough? Do we have the flexibility, the resilience, the social cooperation, the capacity to make necessary changes before it's too late? Homo erectus can't answer these questions for us. But their story reminds us that adaptation has limits, that even successful species can be undone by environmental changes that exceed their capacity to respond. There's another aspect to the Homo erectus legacy that's worth considering: their relationship to us, to modern humans, because they're not just an extinct species we study. They're our ancestors, or at least, they're closely related to our ancestors. The exact evolutionary relationships are still debated, but most researchers agree that some populations of Homo erectus gave rise to later human species, including eventually us. This means that when we look at Homo erectus, we're looking at our family. Every adaptation they developed, every innovation they made, every challenge they overcame, it all contributed to the evolutionary pathway that led to modern humans. We inherited their bipedalism, their endurance walking capability, the basic body plan that allows us to cover distance efficiently. We inherited some of their cognitive abilities, the capacity for social learning, for tool use, for cooperation. These are ancient capabilities, millions of years old, tested and refined in Homo erectus populations before being passed on to us. But we also diverged. Somewhere in our evolutionary history, our lineage split from Homo erectus, developed larger brains, more complex technology, greater capacity for innovation and abstract thought. These differences made us Homo sapiens instead of Homo erectus, made us capable of things they could never achieve. And yet, for all our capabilities, for all our achievements, we haven't outlasted them. We have a long way to go before we can claim to be more successful by the measure that might matter most. Survival time. Maybe we'll make it. Maybe our intelligence and technology will allow us to navigate challenges that would destroy species relying purely on biological adaptation. Maybe we'll survive climate change and resource depletion and all the other existential threats we face. Maybe we'll persist for another 1,000,000 years. 2 million. Maybe we'll exceed Homo erectus and prove that bigger brains and complex technology really are superior survival strategies. Or maybe we won't. Maybe our rapid innovation, our constant change, our transformation of the planet, maybe all of this will be our downfall. Maybe we're too specialized in our dependence on technology, too vulnerable to the complex systems we've built, too capable of creating catastrophic changes that we can't control. The next few centuries will tell. Climate models predict dramatic changes by the year 2100. By 2200, temperatures rising, sea levels rising, ecosystems collapsing, mass extinctions. The question is whether we can adapt, whether we can change our behavior fast enough, whether we have the social cooperation and political will to make necessary sacrifices. Homo erectus couldn't control their environment, couldn't prevent the rainforests from expanding, couldn't engineer their way out of habitat change. They were at the mercy of natural processes beyond their influence. And eventually, those processes killed them. We can control our environment, can engineer, can modify, can choose different paths. And that gives us capabilities Homo erectus never had. But it also gives us responsibilities. The power to shape our future means we're accountable for what that future looks like. We can't blame natural processes if we drive ourselves to extinction. We'll have done it ourselves. The story of Homo erectus, then, is both inspiring and sobering. Inspiring because it shows what's possible, how long a species can last if they're adaptable and resilient and cooperative. How much can be achieved with relatively simple capabilities if you persist long enough. But sobering because it reminds us that all success is temporary, that no species survives forever, that eventually conditions change beyond anyone's capacity to handle them. What we choose to take from their story matters. We can see it as evidence that intelligence isn't everything, that persistence and adaptability and stability matter more than innovation. And there's truth in that. But we can also see it as a challenge, a record to beat, a standard to measure ourselves against. 2 million years of survival. Can we match it? Can we exceed it? The answer depends on choices we make now, on how we handle the environmental crisis we've created, on whether we can cooperate globally to address challenges that transcend national boundaries, on whether we can change our behavior before we change the planet beyond our capacity to survive on it. Homo erectus didn't have these choices. Their fate was sealed by processes beyond their control. But we have agency, have power, have the capability to choose different futures. And that means we bear responsibility for what happens next. Maybe in another million years, if some intelligent species evolves and studies the fossil record, they'll find our remains. They'll piece together our story, and they'll ask the same questions we ask about Homo erectus. How long did they last? How did they survive? The answers to those questions aren't written yet. We're still here, still trying, still adapting, still facing challenges. The story of Homo sapiens is unfinished. The ending is unknown. But the story of Homo erectus is complete. And it's a remarkable story. 2 million years. From pioneering migrants leaving the continent for the first time, to settled populations adapting to islands and deserts and highlands. From simple tool users to sophisticated survivors who mastered their environments through knowledge and cooperation. They were our ancestors, our family. The species that showed what was possible for creatures walking upright with growing brains and developing social complexity. They paved the way, set the standard, created the foundation on which later human species, including us, would build. And for nearly 2 million years, they survived. That's the bottom line, the ultimate measure of success in evolutionary terms. Until finally, they couldn't anymore. Until the rainforests expanded and the adaptations that had served them so well for so long weren't enough. But what a run it was. What a story. The longest-lived human species, the greatest survivors in our lineage. The ones who showed that you don't need to be the smartest or the most advanced to make it in this world. You just need to be resilient enough, adaptable enough, persistent enough, and for nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus was all of these things and more. Their legacy lives on, in our bodies, shaped by evolution that began with them. In our species, carrying forward the human lineage they helped create. And in the lesson they teach us about survival, about adaptation, about the simple, profound importance of persisting when the world keeps changing. Homo erectus, the species time forgot. The survivors no one expected, the ones who lasted longer than anyone thought possible. 2 million years. That's their story. And it's a story worth remembering.